Hi guys, so today we're going to talk about our second part of evolution. We're going to be going over our evidences of evolution. So the past couple of weeks we've talked about what evolution is, we've talked about natural selection and survival of the fittest. Some of y'all were a little confused on fitness when I was grading some of your past assignments. Remember, fitness has to do with the ability to survive long enough to reproduce. So it could be by being sneaky, it could be by being faster, being stronger, being more intimidating, even being able to hide. All of those things could increase fitness because you're able to survive long enough to reproduce. So now we're going to talk about some of our evidences. So what is it that scientists have seen that support natural selection and evolution? All right, so according to the principle of common descent, which is Darwin's fancy word for evolution, all species, living and extinct, are united by descent from common ancestors and exhibit diversity due to natural selection and adaptation. So, what does that mean? So, that means that there's always there's always traits that are shared, and that's because organisms that are very similar have a common ancestor. So, for example, okay, we could think about, let's say, cats. Okay, so cats have certain characteristics that we only see in cats. Um, we see that their claws are able to be extended. They have like whiskers to help them, sense things. They have a lot of little characteristics that we see in big cats and in small cats. And that's because if we look at their ancestors, they also had those characteristics. Some of those characteristics are also shared with dogs, and that's because if we go even further back, we can see that there's a common ancestor between dogs and cats. And so that's what this is talking about. So for example, okay, so if we look at all these different organisms right here, so we have bacteria. So these are the bacteria that can get us sick, and then these are the good bacteria. We have eukaryotes. We know the difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And then we have archaebacteria. So if we go back far enough, we have one single common ancestor. And so when you think about it, when you think about something that relates all three of these organisms, we can just think of a plain old cell. Okay, so everything has a cell, everything has cytoplasm. So remember when at the very beginning of the year, we talked about RCDC. Everything has ribosomes, everything has a cell membrane, everything has DNA, and everything has a cytoplasm. Okay, so all of those things, those four things, unite them, all three of these organisms, and they all have a similar common ancestor. So mechanisms such as natural selection and gene flow are what drive the process of evolution. So it's what causes it to keep on happening. But how do we know that populations have evolved? So we're going to look at those evidences that supports the theory of evolution. So for example, the fossil record. This is usually what we think about when we think about evolution. So fossils from older rock layers can be compared to fossils in the younger rock layers. So if you're looking, for example, at let's say a cliff, all of the rock that's at the bottom of the cliff is going to be older than the rock that's at the top. And so if there's fossils found there, then that means that those fossils are also older. So here's an example. Okay, so here's one area. We could see that down towards the bottom, we have different types of fossils than we have towards the top. These at the bottom are going to be older than the ones at the top. And it's going to be the same for all four of these. So the deeper you go, the older those fossils are. And then we're able to determine how old that ground is by comparing the fossils. You could see that these blue fossils over here, even though they're at the bottom, they're found at the top over here. And so this helps us determine that these little purple or pink things that look like starfish are actually older than these blue things. All right, so we can also look at biogeographic evidence. So studying the patterns of geographic distribution of species today can provide evidence of evolution. So, for example, if we look at the variety of species of Galapagos finches, they're closely related. So they have a common ancestor, but they look different enough because they live in different habitats. So we could see right here, here's all, not all, but most of our Galapagos finches. And we could tell by looking at their heads, they're all different types of finches. But if we look at their beaks are used for different things. And so the beaks help because it helps them adapt to their environment. And they're able to get food, as well as, use different, tools and stuff like that. That way, they don't starve to death. But if we go back far enough, we have an ancestral seed eater. And so this was a common ancestor for all of these different birds. And so depending on their habitats, they gained adaptations to live and survive in those habitats. So we look at grassland birds on different continents. They're not closely related, but they're similar. So, for example, if we look at some, wrens here in America, and then we compare them to maybe, let's say, sparrows, in Europe, they're going to be very similar because they grew up in the same habitat. They're probably going to eat the same thing, but maybe they're not very closely related because we have our U.S. wrens versus our UK sparrows. So here's a good example. Okay, so here's some grassland birds. So this little guy, okay, he's found in North America, and he's going to live in the grasslands in North America. This one lives in South America. It looks very different from the one in North America. And if we keep on going, we can see that they all look somewhat different. The one in Australia looks different than the one in Europe. The one in Europe looks different than the one in Asia, but they all live in similar habitats. So this one's a little confusing. We can look at anatomical evidence. So we can look at the anatomy, the body structures. So we have what are called homologous body structures. So this is when they have the same structure, but the function is different. Okay, and when we're talking about the structure, typically we're talking about the bones that are inside whatever that structure is. So there are similarities among the body parts, especially in animals with backbones. And so this gives us evidence that all four-limbed vertebrates have descended with modification from a common ancestor. We're going to be watching a video later during the week on this. So if you look at these different organisms, okay, so this is really interesting, but if you look at the turtle, an alligator, a bird, and a horse, so the bones that are actually the same are colored the same. So for example, okay, so if I look right here at the humerus, that's this bone right here, okay, that's the yellow bone, for all of these organisms. So the turtle, the alligator, the bird, and the horse, they all have this bone. And then next, if we look at the radius and the ulna, which is right here, okay, this is our forearm. Again, all these organisms have those bones, and you can see the horse is modified, and that makes sense because horses weigh a lot. They need a sturdier bone. And so all the way down from the wrist to the carpals and to the metacarpals. So all those bones are the same. They may be modified because these animals are in different environments. And so we have actually found fossils that have these bones. So there's a fish called Tiktaalik, and so Tiktaalik actually showed the beginning of these bones. It was a fossilized fish, so it's no longer living, but they actually have seen that this fossilized fish who's extinct has started to show these bones, and these bones are now found in all different organisms. All right, so we have homologous structures, okay, so same structure, different function, and we have analogous structures. So analogous structures are same function, but the structures are different. So they have different structures, but the same function. So this does not indicate evolutionary relationship. What this does indicate is that these organisms have grown up in the same type of environment. So for example, okay, if I look at a butterfly, okay, butterflies we know have wings. Birds also have wings, but birds have bones in their wings, while butterflies, because they're invertebrates, they don't have bones there. Okay, so because they don't have bones, like if you, look at a butterfly, let's say a butterfly dies, you're going to notice that it's just all very flimsy, a very flimsy wing. So if you look at a bird wing, though, there are bones running inside of it. And so, if we're looking at those wings, they're both used for flying. And so they grow up in the same environment. They both have to fly, but the structures are completely different. Okay, so it's the same thing if we look at a moth wing. Okay, and we can look right here. This one I think is a bat wing. I think that's what this is supposed to be. And this middle one right here is a bird wing. And then this last one is actually like a pterodactyl wing, so from a dinosaur. And so we can see that, these three right here at the bottom, they all have bones. The moth does not. But they're all used for flying. Okay, so they have the same function, but the structures are completely different. All right, so after homologous and analogous, we have something called a vestigial body structure. So these are really cool. These are actually structures that have lost all or part of their original function. And so you may think, for example, of your appendix. So we don't use our appendix. Scientists think that maybe, back in the day, the appendix was used because it has really strong enzymes to break down like raw food diets. So if we look at some of our ancestors, they were eating things like, bark and grass and, would accidentally eat rocks. Those enzymes would help break that down. But we really don't know. And, if we go outside, we don't eat those things right now. And so our appendix, we don't necessarily use at all. So that's why it's okay, if you have appendicitis, it's okay to take it out because you don't need it. Also, did you know that whales actually have pelvic bones? So if you actually look at a whale skeleton, they have residual hip bones. And so that was because at some point, and we've seen this in fossils, ancestral whales actually had back legs. And so our current whales don't have those, and but they still have the remnants of those bones there. So if you look right here, okay, so here's my whale, and then they have these vestigial bones right here in the back. And so, those bones, at one point for the ancestral organisms did help them walk, and we have seen that in some of our fossils. All right, so what's the difference between homologous and analogous? Let's see if you can get this. Okay, so remember, homologous have the same structure, but they have different functions. Analogous have a different structure, but same function. So homologous, remember, homologous are the same bones. Okay, so like for example, between a horse, a cat, a whale, they all have the same bones, but they're used differently. Analogous means that they grew up in the same environment. And so if you compare a moth wing to a bat wing to a pterodactyl wing, all the structures are different, but they're used the same. All right, so embryology. Okay, so embryology is also really cool. So if you look at early stages of embryos, especially in animals that have backbones, they're all very, very similar. And some of the very early embryos, you can't tell the difference. And so this also provides evidence that we share a common ancestor. So for example, okay, so if I didn't give you the labels here of these embryos, okay, so this one right here, you wouldn't probably be able to tell the difference between this one over here. Okay, so if I just told you these are 4 animals that have backbones, you probably wouldn't be able to tell me what they are. And so you could see that they all have some similarities. And so, for example, the one that's actually written out is gill pouches. I don't know if y'all know this, but in utero, humans start out with gills. Okay, so we all started out with gills, and then during development, we actually have genes that turn on to seal up those gills. And, I always get the question that if somebody's born with gills, would they still work? No, they wouldn't work. So not all gills are used to breathe underwater. And you can actually see that. There are some people who have that mutation that those gill slits actually never get covered up. It doesn't look like how you think. So you can Google that and see what it actually looks like. It doesn't look like gills if somebody has that mutation. Okay, also tails. Okay, so most of y'all know this, but in utero, we also have a tail. And so there are some mutations, again, where some babies are born with little bitty tails. But while we're developing in utero, you have some genes that turn on that will actually cause us to absorb that tail, so that way it's dissolved. And you have, or animals like, for example, birds, reptiles, pigs, those genes don't turn on, so they are born with tails. All right. Okay, so molecular evidence. This is actually the best type of evidence. And so you've probably heard about comparing DNA between ourselves and other organisms. So right now, for example, scientists are trying to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. And so what they're doing is they're using cells that have very similar DNA structure to ours. That way we know that the vaccine will most likely, if it works on those cells, it's going to work on ours. And so scientists are able to look at those similarities in DNA. So if you remember, DNA codes for RNA, RNA codes for protein. And so if the DNA is the same, then that means that the proteins coded are going to be the same. And so then from there, we could say that those evolutionary relationships are very, very close. If the amino acids are similar, then the proteins are similar. All right, so when we compare DNA sequences and amino acids, we're able to determine how closely related we are to different organisms by how similar that DNA is. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I'm out of time. So next week, we're going to use those similarities and we're going to construct what are called evolutionary trees. And so we'll be able to, map out who's related to who and what characteristics do they share. Until then, bye.